Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this LSE Library event. I'm Gillian Murphy, I'm one of the curators in the library, and I'm delighted to welcome Sheila Rowbotham and Sally Alexander tonight. In the Women's Library at LSE, we proudly look after the archives of Sheila and of Sally, and lots of other women's liberation activists. And tonight, Sheila is going to talk about her new memoir, Daring to Hope, which was published last month. And Sally Alexander is going to respond. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them into the Q&A and we'll ask them at the end. So over to you, Sheila. Well, Sheila, you need to unmute yourself.
Is that unmuted?
That's it. Yep, you can hear you now.
Sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
I'm glad that you've all been able to come, especially because it's quite close to Christmas and it's so busy for everyone. But the people who've really put the work into organising this is the Curator for Equality, Rights and Citizenship, Gillian Murphy, and the Education Outreach Officer at the Women's Library, Debbie Sheilas, who both of whom you've heard from. And I do want to say how grateful I am to Sally, because although we've sort of travelled the same journey in many ways, there are differences in our experiences, and she's had to read with that kind of care that comes from when you're actually going to comment on something, which is much more really than just reading a book, at a time when she's got so many things that she's doing, including her day today, which was spent looking after her grandson. This book that I've just finished, Daring to Hope, is my second trip backwards into my life. And it picks up where Promise of a Dream, my account of the 1970s, ended. I want to begin this evening with a shared memory. It was in February 1969 that Sally and I travelled to a revolutionary festival with a friend, Jean McCrindle. It was organised by students at Essex University, and it proved to be the first large public gathering in Britain where women's liberation was raised. And in Promise of a Dream, this is how I described us going down in the car. Although unsure what to expect, we were charged with a powerful sense of anticipation. I remember the intensity of our talking and the feeling of shared discovery. Ideas in these early days of women's liberation seemed to just spring out of a process of recognition. This connection of experience was all the more remarkable because it was an exchange of perceptions which had been so private. All those reactions, those vagrant thoughts which you'd kept to yourself, suddenly came to acquire a new social meaning. With the newfound affinities came a corresponding realization of distances. I sat in the back seat of the car thinking how Sally and Jean had a bond I could not share, for they both were the mothers of young daughters. The young daughters have got older now and times have moved on, but it was a sense of something that I couldn't really comprehend at that time from an inner sense. Well, since then, I've been asked many times to write down or talk about how women's liberation emerged as a movement. And I've often pondered as a historian why it was that the vagrant thoughts acquired a new social meaning at that particular time. It's possible to crayon in the sort of broad outlines, like the expansion of higher education, the impact of civil rights and Black power from the 1960s in the States, militant trade union action in Britain on the part of women as well as men. And this was the previous year, there'd been the struggle for equal pay among the Ford's women. Dissident cultural rebellions that were part of our surroundings, and the widespread impact of left-wing radical ideas, and so on. But it's nevertheless very hard to trace the interconnections between these and individual perceptions. Being a historian and a time-traveling nosy person, I frequently thought, oh, if only I was there, I'd understand why it happened or what it felt like. And being there is certainly an advantage of, but it doesn't necessarily take you into the experience of other participants. So my particular memories are there for others to compare and contrast. Daring to Hope is not the history or even a history of a social movement for the emancipation of women, but it is, however, I hope, a contribution towards such a broader endeavor, which others will do in the future. Because I think that a personal account brings to life the written documents. I thought then, and still think now, that the liberation of women, that is all women, not just an elite, necessitates profound changes in capitalism and the kinds of hierarchical power it's grafted itself onto. So Daring to Hope is also about my socialism. More personally, my personal self, am there, tussling through, falling in love several times, earning a somewhat precarious living, learning about history, trying to understand economics, which I never really could, but I always felt I ought to, meeting older feminists, socialists and trade unionists, all of which I very much enjoyed, women as well as men, watching films, plays, listening to music, and having a son and making friends. Many of the friends have remained with me in my life over the decades. So I haven't written a book only about politics, but about the interconnection between my personal experience and radical politics. Well, memories are notoriously unreliable when it comes to chronology. So in order to work out dates, I drew on two main sources of written material: the archive of my papers, which Gillian mentioned, in the Women's Library at LSE, and letters, fragments of journals and appointment diaries in my own possession. I complemented these by looking at material in the Women's Library that was deposited by Anna Davin, and also in the Feminist archive South at the University of Bristol. There are papers deposited by Marilyn Porter, who I used to go and visit sometimes in Bristol at that time. And I discovered there an article I'd completely forgotten I'd ever written. As this was about my life, though, I did confine myself largely to relating events in which I'd participated. So it's a kind of vision of women's liberation from a particular perspective. Over to Sally.
Thank you, Sheila. Well, I also would like to say thank you very much to Gillian Murphy and to Debbie Chalice for organizing this event, and to the Women's Library for hosting it. And thank you, Sheila, for writing Dare to Hope, which is wonderful. And your second volume of memoir, And you've chosen to write decade by decade because, as you say, your sources include diaries and letters and personal documents and archives and journals, personal journals and letters and papers from archives, but also because you've already written a comparative history of the United States and Britain, The Past is Before Us, which is a book I strongly recommend. And so these 2 volumes of memoirs combine, as you say, personal history with history of the times, the decades, you know, in which you've lived and which we're looking back to, which belong to those twilight years between memory and history. They're still within living history, the 60s and the 70s. But when our generation dies off, they will no longer be within living memory. You know, they won't. So they have a sort of vividness and freshness that is worth, as historians, thinking about. I should perhaps say to you that, to those of you listening, it's very difficult because I can't see you, but that I've known Sheila since the mid 60s, since about 67. We met in London around a journal called The Black Dwarf, which was started by Clive Goodwin and several other leftist writers and directors and political activists. And it was based, it was a radical newspaper, it was envisaged as a radical newspaper, and Sheila was writing for it, and I was helping to raise money and generally running around doing whatever I was asked to do. And that's where Sheila and I first met. So it's a long, long time ago. Okay, so as I say, this Dare to Hope, which is published by Verso, thank you to Verso, follows Promise of a Dream. And Promise of the Dream, which I know from my students and everyone I know who's read it, is a wonderfully readable book, and it records the growth of a young woman's mind and political experience from Yorkshire, from a Yorkshire sixth form to the life of a postgraduate student of Eric Hobsbawm's at Birkbeck. Sheila was an political activist sort of around the epoch of the early New Left and of 68. Direct and frank in personal feeling, Sheila writes in the vein of earlier feminist authors, and I suppose this is the first most significant point to make really about the kind of writing this memoir is, that like Mary Wollstonecraft, Olive Schreiner, Rosa Luxemburg, Alexandra Kollontai, Doris Lessing, several of whom are written about in this book, Sheila writes about love, sexual love, friendship, and later in the decade, maternal or parental love. Love in all its manifestations is as much part of the story as her times. And describing her love for friends, for lovers, for her child later on, she explores the sources of feeling, the ways in which passion captures the soul as well as the body. It binds the lovers, and the ways in which, when you love someone deeply, one person sort of flows into another. And what Sheila is particularly good at describing and writing about in her poems, as well as in these memoirs, is her inner struggles, or the ambivalent inner struggles, against dependence and against the tyrannies of negative emotion, jealousy, and possessiveness, which so bedevil the would-be free young women we once were in the 60s and 70s. Reading through the memoir, her fear of dependence and even of possessiveness and jealousy mutates and changes, particularly as she has a child when there's a recognition, right from early on in the 70s actually, that raising a child and bringing a child up requires a certain forms of dependence and interdependence, which are absolutely necessary. Among Sheila's earlier books, Women, Resistance and Revolution, which is one of my favorites, Dreamers of a New World, Edward Carpenter, as well as the subjects of many of her essays, I think in particular of her little piece on Marilyn Monroe, which I think appeared in The Guardian or in Spare Rib, and of the wonderful oral histories included in her book, Dutiful Daughters, which she edited with Jean McCrindle. And there are many brief vignettes in Dare to Hope too. Of course, these themes of love and history and political activism and the deep struggles with possessiveness and independence are all touched on. And in this book, for example, there are many examples, and those encounters that Sheila describes with older women, with other generations, and I think particularly of Gertie Roach, a Leeds clothing worker, a trades unionist, an organizer of a strike of 30,000 women in the early 1970s in Leeds, with, as Sheila says, the eyes of a tigress. She asked Sheila, when they were talking together, whether she, Sheila, was emancipated only in her own life, in her private life, she meant. And even Sheila was taken aback by this question. In other words, Sheila writes in that, along that vein of feeling, which is both personal and political, and is absolutely crucial to, or part of everyone's lives, even though it's not often written about. And she makes it clear that political subjectivity, radical political subjectivity, is proximate to erotic and intimate life for feminists, as indeed it is for most people in their daily life. Dare to Hope traces the history, or the history and the emergence of the movement from its beginnings, which came out of silence, Sheila describes eloquently, seeking the words and sentences to make sense of a reality, a political reality, and a radical future, which is not yet been defined and is not yet there. And as Sheila's already said, inspiration was borrowed from Black power, from civil rights, from industrial struggles. But a new women's politics had to be created. Small groups, community struggles, consciousness raising, much reading and producing of magazines, setting up of women's centres as much grassroots community activity, as well as making formal demands of the state. And the book traces the frissons and divisions which develop through that decade, the decade of the 70s. Arguments over, for example, and this is, people will have their own memories, wages for housework, separatism, sexuality, the state, you know, what differences and disagreements over the state. And the the point that I want to make really, and to ask Sheila about, is the new politics of women's liberation were both democratic and prefigurative. And democracy, as Sheila records it and describes it, every page is filled with incident and with fascinating encounters with other people. I cannot tell you how well written this book is, and how readable it is. But democracy is an intensely argumentative ideal and taskmaster. And every woman in women's liberation in the 1970s and now had the right to speak. Everyone was equal. So living that democracy and that living out that democracy and practicing that democracy was very demanding. And prefigurative politics, snatching at the future in the present lives, the way people tried to live, new forms of loving, as I've already described, Sheila is working on, living communally, sharing housework, sharing their tasks, living ethically is very, very tough. And Sheila doesn't flinch from describing those toughnesses. So those difficulties. So Sheila, I think I'd first like to ask you about the distinctive, to say something a little bit about the distinctive qualities of democracy and prefigurative politics, which kind of mingled in the women's liberation movement in the 70s, which is what your book's about, but you might want to pick out the odd example or say a bit more about it.
There was a really strong emphasis. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me? There was such a strong emphasis on not having a hierarchical structure and not having leaders. I think that was partly because we were reacting against vanguardist left groups who had a very sort of command structure. The last thing in the world we wanted was that. I personally had seen the impact of being called leaders in America, signaled out by the media as leaders, and they really suffered personally from that, because it was an impossible strain for any individual. The media thought that if anybody wrote anything, they were automatically leaders, and that was just not the case. As anybody who's been in a social movement knows, that some people write things and other people are doing other things, and the ones who write are not always the ones who are the best at kind of saying we ought to do this next or something. And we created these forms of organizing very much influenced by Americans who were in Britain, partly because of opposition to the Vietnam War. They had participated in the American New Left, which was very keen to distinguish itself from Stalinism in the Soviet Union. They didn't want to be connected to that kind of politics, because in America, they'd seen the impact of the McCarthy witch hunts, and they wanted to create an alternative left. So we had some of those ideas, and I think that the Tufnell Park group, which was a very early group, had quite a few American women in it. And I remember going there, it must have been 1969, and it was extraordinary for me because I've only ever been in meetings that were all in rows, and there we were in a circle sitting on the floor, and it was in somebody's home. It was completely different atmosphere. There was also a woman called Lois Gressel who created the first centre for the London Women's Liberation Workshop, and Lois had been active in the civil rights movement and remembered the things that they'd learned about non-hierarchical organizing. And our little groups were places where people could speak who'd never spoken in a meeting ever before. And they had an extraordinary impact on a whole generation of women who went through those little groups. And they were developed in other ways when the women's centres slightly later were set up, because women's health groups were formed. And then people formed groups that were not necessarily local women's liberation consciousness raising groups, but groups around particular interests around women and film and the media, for example. But there was always that attempt to have extensive participation. The problem, I think, was that it worked when it was in a small group, and it was very, very difficult when we then had large conferences. I mean, sometimes there were several hundred, but then they grew to be about 2,000 people coming to the conferences. So then it always was very, very difficult. And I never forget the heroic Catherine Hall chairing one of those conferences. Catherine had an ability to manage to stay calm when everybody else was getting extremely het up. So there were difficulties, and there were difficulties that were pointed out in the democracy of the small groups too, because sometimes, because we had no structure, a formal structure, it became really who could sort of manage to chip in, who could express themselves best, because there wasn't anyone to say formally, let's try to get this a bit broader. So I think it wasn't that we created some ideal form of organizing that solved all problems, but we had created a form of organizing that meant even if we didn't particularly get on with people, in all the people in the groups we were in, hearing about their personal life and feelings meant that you were really much more able to empathize with them, which I think was a really great strength of the early years of women's liberation. It didn't prevent political conflict and splits finally by the end, but it was very, very important and enabled us to do lots of things that we wouldn't have done before.
It's very interesting, Sheila, because actually your relationship with socialism, the relationship between you and the socialist groups and the history of socialism, and you came out of socialism into the women's movement, didn't you? In a way, I mean, you'd already been an activist in many socialist struggles during the 1960s. So when women's liberation began to take shape in the late 1960s, out of all the different political movements that you've described, you'd already kind of got a relationship to socialism in your mind. And I don't think that was true of all feminists, as you've said. And it was interesting to me reading your memoir that it's not really until about the middle of the 70s, or maybe 76, 77, when you begin to think with a group of, partly in conversation with friends like Hilary Wainwright and Lynn Seagull and Jean McCrindle, with whom you wrote Beyond the Fragments, that you began to think, actually, maybe a different form of socialist struggle has to be developed out of the women's liberation movement, or out of the lessons we've learned from the politics of grassroots organizing and so on. Is that the case, would you say, or am I putting too strong an emphasis on your relationship to socialism?
Well, no, I mean, to understand the 70s, there were many social movements, weren't there? I mean, there were movements around prisons, movements of tenants, movements, as we mentioned, of trade unionists and rank and file trade unionists taking action. So
claimants.
Also the claimants union, which was challenging the top-down state, health groups, community politics, and also the arrival of by the end of the 70s, larger numbers of women from Black and South Asian heritage who were organizing in their own groups, but linking in with other people too. And there was conflict with the extreme right, because the fascists were activated on issues to do with anti-Semitism, but they were also activated because of the presence of people from South Asia and the Caribbean who were living in Britain, in large cities particularly. So we were part of a lot of things that were going on, plus all the radical theatre groups that were going around, in working men's clubs and community halls. So there was a vision of something that could be much wider kind of radical socialist movement than we had in simply in the small left groups which had formed and had grown over the period of the 70s. So there was some sense that we might be able to make a different kind of left.
Yes, and what about one of the difficulties, you describe many of the difficulties. I mean, you've talked about, or you mentioned just now, vanguardism and leadership, and the idea that many socialist groups and organizations and socialist parties, indeed, finding the line and then imposing it, whereas women's liberation and the grassroots organizations that you've described, but also struggles like, I remember when Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams came out of prison after their spell of imprisonment. I mean, so many things have changed in the struggle in Northern Ireland. But one of the things I remember them talking about was the way in which they'd studied and learned and read and run political discussion groups inside prison. And in fact, my brother, who was in prison during the 80s and for a long period of time, and was traveling around some of Britain's worst prisons during the 80s, sort of extremely unpolitical drugs-related issue. He said that the people who were the most organized and able to survive long sentences were the IRA, particularly the Northern Irish, because they had the discipline and the drive, and they could learn and study. Sorry, that's a bit of a diversion, but that's a bit of an interesting diversion. But Northern Ireland struggles are very present in your memoir, and that's as well as anti-fascism, as well as conversations and discussions with emergent groups and of Black women and Asian women, and within unions as well as within women's organizations. But one of the difficulties with socialism is the ways in which feminism, women's liberation, emphasized the prefigurative politics and the slogan, "the personal is political." Would you like to say something more about that? or not?
The American New Left was interested in prefigurative politics. I think probably it's always been the libertarian or anarchist part of the left, which has imagined that individuals would change at the same time changing society. Those people who were around in, for example, in the pre-Leninist socialist movement, like the man that I became really obsessed with, the gay pioneer Edward Carpenter, were interested in changing oneself at the same time as changing society. So I think it was really because the Leninist left had been formed by the experience in the Soviet Union, where it was such a harsh regime. I mean, it was to be trying to emphasize personal expression and freedom was very, very difficult when they were locked in very fierce combat with the state. So I think that in those circumstances, those ideas tended to get squashed out. But even there, they didn't entirely. And going back, Trotsky wrote this interesting book called Problems of Life, which he talked actually about the kinds of changes that women were emphasizing in the Russian Revolution. So it's always sort of being there, but it often gets suppressed as being trivial and unimportant, and also idealistic. And to say that you can totally transform yourself by an effort of will is idealistic, certainly. But to have ideas of changing your practice, as the modern ecological movement shown, is obviously something that's also politically necessary. I'm wondering.
Yes, I mean,
I wonder how we're doing with the time.
Well, I think it's time to hand over to the audience. I'm sure people want to ask questions.
Gillian's got people probably.
You can talk for a little bit longer. I think it's 20 minutes to 7, so you're okay. So it gives people a chance to put questions in the Q&A.
I would just like to say that what's often thought of is that women's liberation was completely separate from other kinds of politics, and actually women from women's liberation were working in all these issues in Women's Centre, Essex Road. They worked with women at Holloway Prison, for example, and Lynn Siegel was involved in that. And then there were also many campaigns which involved local women who wouldn't necessarily have come to a women's liberation group, like the Family at Arms campaign, and abortion, and particularly actually the situation of struggling for conditions, for better conditions for under fives in the city. And there was a very strong movement that finally developed. Took quite a long time, because there was a division between people who wanted to go for the old demand of state nurseries and people who wanted to set up their own women's liberation nurseries, which were called community nurseries. And my son went to one of those, which was a community nursery that was squatted in an old deanery, and then gradually got funding from Hackney Council, called Market Nursery, which was a wonderful place.
In fact, I mean, those people who wanted to work, make demands of the state and get the local state and the or the central state to fund and to support their demands. That's another theme of the memoir, because it crops up again and again over so many different issues. But
can Can I just say,
yes, I mean,
one time you said to me, when I was going on about the problems of the state, you said to me, having had a child, you said to me, Sheila, women need the state. And I never forgot that.
yes.
I think that's a good point to start the questions now. So we've got two questions. So the first question is for Sheila. So looking back at your political views from the 1970s, is there any issue on which you would say you have completely changed your stance in the years since? And how did that change occur?
I don't. Have I changed my stance? I suppose the sobering influence of the late 70s and living through the 80s made me less likely to be going on about total transformation of society and the sort of revolutionary vision of the late 60s and the early 70s. I adapted to thinking about the particular changes that we needed in practice. And also, I worked at the GLC in the 1980s, so we were trying to root visionary, transformatory politics in the immediate needs of people in London at the GLC. And a lot of women who were feminists went into the GLC, and the Women's Committee played a very pioneering role, and it was led by a very young woman called Valerie Wise, daughter of Audrey Wise. I think she was in her early 20s now at that time.
So our next question is, were you involved in any anti-war movements?
We'd all been involved in the opposition to the Vietnam War, many of us, not all, but many women who got involved in women's liberation. Some actually had not. I remember it was quite interesting in one group, hearing women talk about what had got them into the group. And they'd been active in CND in the early 60s and in anti-apartheid. Then some of them had had children and been rather put off by the militant demonstrations against the Vietnam War. I mean, I started off when I became a socialist, being involved in CND, and then later got involved in the opposition to the war in Vietnam. And I was very proud because I got sent a Christmas card from the Vietnam Women's Organization. They didn't know how to reach me, so they sent it to Robin Blackburn, who was involved with the New Left Review, and he passed it on to me. So I think we've been talking about Britain, but women's liberation was so international. And we were in contact with each other by, in fact, I think partly student travel was quite cheap, so people would just arrive in another country. We also went by boat often because people still traveled by boat.
Okay. Our next question is to both of you, as you're both historians. Did you have a sense of following in the footsteps of previous campaigners for women's rights earlier in the 20th century or in the centuries before that? And did that inform your thinking at all?
Oh, Sally, why don't you say something? Sally, you?
Well, one of the themes of the memoir is the precarious living that Sheila made as a writer and as a historian, and all the various odd jobs she had to do in order to support herself and to support her research, because I think women's history, the history of feminism, was, we didn't use the word feminism in 1970, did we, Sheila? I mean, the history of women's, what did women do in the past? And what were political activists who were women? How did they live? That was a very, very important question. And how did women organize, in trades unions, in their communities? How did they manage raising children and working in factories? Those were questions that we, when I say we, I mean throughout the nation, as it were. I mean, in every part of Britain, different women's groups were exploring their own history. So, and it took quite a long time for that to build up, and that knowledge to build up. But Sheila and I, and Barbara Taylor, and many other feminists, and Catherine Hall, and Anna Davin, and many other historians learnt our trade and learnt the history of women's history, and of feminist history, the history of political struggles, by teaching in adult education and doing our research literally kind of as we walked into the class, because we didn't know, we had to rediscover the earlier generations of feminist historians, and there are many, but we didn't know them, so we had to kind of re-find them.
Women in my Workers' Education Association classes went and interviewed their mothers and wrote and also talked about their own memories.
Yes.
Wrote essays on that. So they were people who came voluntarily, and they, as well as, I mean, the Workers' Education Association has been mainly for working class men in the early days, but many women by that, at the time we were teaching, were coming in because they were at home with small children, and there was a way in which they could get to the WA classes because they were able to have some childcare, and it was possible to get to them. So I had women with small children.
So did I. I taught
Juliet
many
Mitchell
classes.
Did a very early class, which was one of the very first women's liberation groups, isn't that right, Sam?
Yes.
Okay, we've got two more questions. We've probably got time for those. What did working in the GLC reveal about the limits of trying to change things via the state?
Well, when, if we had a wheeze that we thought it would be really good if there could be such a thing, those things, unless there was a group on the ground who was prepared to put the work in and actually wanted them, those things just never worked. The things that worked were things that had the commitment of people, and those also were the things that survived. I mean, one of the things that have survived actually was things like the coffee, the coffee that we now have in our supermarkets, which was one of the initiatives originally of from industry and employment at the GLC, but it became very widespread, and it survived long after the GLC was abolished. It was a group called Twin Trading that developed that kind of cooperative trade, fair trade.
Okay, another question now. Do you see parallels with the 1970s activism and the late 19th century and Edwardian social movements for women's rights?
I personally, yes, I've spent a lot of time pursuing those women in different ways. One of the early ones I came across was a South African woman, Olive Schreiner. I later, and of course, there's Eleanor Marx, who, people are still interested in Eleanor Marx. I think some of the women have faded again in memory, but it was possible to meet people who had been active in the late 19th century and early 20th century, still in the 1970s. And I met someone called Florence Extenham in Stanmore through my Workers' Education Association class. And she was in her 80s when I went to interview her. And the first thing she said to me when I said about women's liberation, she said, well, of course, you're not interested in the trade unions like we were. She'd been a militant suffragette, and she was from a socialist working class family. And her idea of us was that we were always busy burning our bras and things like that, which is what the media said about us. So there was a moment of mutual incomprehension. And then we both realized that we had got the wrong idea of each other's movements. So learning that the suffrage movement was much broader in both composition and in its aims and objectives were something that people like Jill Liddington and others have contributed to.
Okay.
Yes, and I thought I was terribly interested to learn as I started to study the suffrage movement in the late 19th century that of course they were all so many of them were trying to live out the changes in their lives and live collectively and study and learn and change, and they were involved in strikes and, you know, as well as politics, and they were arguing over conditions at work as well as what the vote would mean, and sexuality as well. I mean, tremendous. When a women's movement emerges, I mean, the configurations are different, but there's always, you know, that mix of concerns of sexuality, of private lives, of personal lives, public politics, you know, democratic organization.
There were working class women too who tried to put those ideas into practice, but the majority of working class women who got involved in radical politics, I think, opted for a more cautious approach, because I remember one woman in particular in Glasgow said there was a woman called Annie Gordon who'd tried to, you know, live in a free union and be a new woman and free, and her life became very tragic and difficult. And I think that was the reason probably why the majority of women who were able to change their sexual lives, people like Dora Russell, for example, who I met and liked a lot, they tended to be from the middle class, really the upper middle class. But there was ideas of democratizing personal relationships in the early 20th century to reach working class women.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. How did you find not having a hierarchical structure in organisations impacted in the way women experienced, emotionally experienced the movement?
I think it was a very emotional time in the very early days, because we were so excited to be discovering all these things and forming these new relationships. One of the problems of that probably was that because our personal beings were so poured into it, it was difficult to separate our inner feelings from the politics. And when the politics became conflictual, then people became very, very hurt and upset. And that made it very difficult to have some kind of pragmatic alliances. What do you think, Sally?
Yes. I mean, yes. I agree with you that the excitement and the emotion and the intensity was unsettling politically and personally.
But But I guess it was all, I mean, it was also very joyous sometimes. It was
Very.
yeah. And some of that joy is expressed in the film A Woman's Place. It was one of the few early records of women's liberation. Of the this has also includes the 1970 conference, but the 1971 dancing through the snow, singing, you know, we. Lord,
We're young, keep young and beautiful.
Keep
young and beautiful.
If you want to be loved. Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of a film that my granddaughter, who's 24 and has been very active in various forms of politics, sent me of one of the demonstrations. I mean, I think it went a bit viral on social media, of Extinction Rebellion, where people were dancing around, you know, to Yellow Submarine or something like that, and which was just echoing, you know, early women's liberation demonstrations, and many since. I mean, not only women's liberation, but there is an element of joyousness and hope and exhilaration in demonstrating.
And the songs are so important. I mean, songs that were found from America, songs like Bread and Roses, which is very beautiful. But also, I loved that Sandra Kerr did a very, very amusing song called A Maintenance Engineer, about work in the home and her sexual relationship. And that, well, I don't know if it's not about her personally, but it's about women, and it's a great song, and should be brought back.
I think we're coming to the end of our event now, and I want to say a really big thank you to Sheila and Sally for a very interesting evening and listening to all your memories from the 1970s. And a big thank you to the audience for coming tonight and joining us. So do say goodbye in the chat, and the event will close in a few moments.
Mm-hmm.